So we have our driver package set up, and now it's time to use that driver package to connect our application to the database. And we're going to do that using the repository pattern. So we already have one repository, if you recall, and if we look at our main go.file, we can see where that is. And that's way down here, where we create a new repository, and that calls handler's new repo. And what we're going to do is add something to this repository, which is itself a repository, because my goal here is to set up my application in such a way that right now I'm going to use Postgres. But if down the road I want to use, say, MySQL or MariaDB or Oracle or some other database, I can do so, and when I make that change, I change as little of the application as possible. And the repository pattern is ideal for that particular situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new package, and I'm going to do it on my internal. I'm going to create a new package, so I'll just create a new directory, which will be a package, and I'm going to call that repository. And inside of that, I'm going to create another package. So inside of the repository directory, I'll create another directory, which I'm going to call db repo. And at the root level of repository, not inside the db repo, but inside the repository folder, I'll create a Go file. And I will call that repository.go. And I will add that to Git. And that file right now is very, very simple. I'm just going to create a type in here, an interface. Type, and I'll call it database repo, which is an interface. And right now it will be empty. We'll add something to that in a little while. And inside of the db repo folder, I'll create a new file. And I will call that, not surprisingly, dbrepo.go. And I will add that to Git as well. Now inside of here, I'm going to create a type. And that type will be the repository itself. And the type will be called Postgres DB repo. And it's a struct. And it will hold two things. It will hold an app, which will be a pointer to our config.appconfig. So it's going to hold that. And it's also going to hold a database connection pool, which, as you know, is a pointer to, for Postgres, of SQL So that's a type, which I'm currently not using. Now I'm going to create a new function. And just as we did with our other repository, this is created using a function, which I'll call new Postgres repo. And it will take a parameter, actually a couple of parameters. One I'll call con because it's a connection pool, and it's a pointer to SQL. And the other one is a, and it's just a pointer to our config, appconfig. And it's going to return a repository database repo. Better spell repository right. And just as we did with our other repository, we'll just return a reference to Postgres DB repo. And of course that has to take two arguments in order to be populated. App, which we have as a parameter we're passing here, a, and our DB, which will be our connection pool. All right, so now I have a means of passing this function, our connection pool, and our app config, and returning a repository. And because I'm now initializing this using new Postgres repo, it will be a connection pool that has Postgres connection pool. If I wanted to have another database, I would simply create a new type, say type MySQL DB repo, which would hold whatever is required for that, our app config and a connection pool for MySQL. And I'd create a new function called func new MySQL repo and create that. So now I have a means of swapping out my database very, very quickly. All right, so this is created. Now what am I going to do with this? Well, let's go back to our main file, main.go. And down in the run function, I want to initialize my database here. I want to actually initialize my database repo. And I can do that pretty easily. I could say right after this, app.session, I can just say connect to database. And what am I going to do? I'll write to the terminal, log.println, connecting to database, just to get some feedback. and then actually do the connection. So I will call db error. I'm going to get my connection pool, and I get that from my driver package that we created in the last lecture. And the method on that is connect SQL. And then we have our DSN. And our DSN, I'm going to hard code it right now. We'll change that before we're finished with this project. But right now, I'm just going to hard code it just to get it working. So we'll do it just like we did in our test database application. Host equals localhost. Port equals 5432. DB name is equal to bookings. I think that's what I called it. We'll find out in a minute. User equals TCS, and of course your username will be different. And my password is currently empty, so I'll just put password in there. I could leave it out, but eventually you're going to be connecting to a database that has a password, so we may as well take that into account right now. So that will do our connection. Then we test for our error. If error is not equal to nil, what do I want to do? Well, I'll just log.fatal, because if I can't connect to my database, bad things are happening. And I'll print the message. Cannot connect to database, dying, because I'll die with that log.fatal. Now that I have this connected, I have my database connection pool. What am I going to do with it? Well, if you recall, one of the things that I said we should do is close it when we're done with it. So I could write defer db.close, db.sql.close. But if I do that, what's going to happen? I'm actually in a function called run, which is called up here. The very first thing I do in my main function is call that. So if I open my connection to the database and then put defer close, and then the run function is finished, it will close the database connections immediately after the run finishes, which, is no good because I'll close my database connections right after opening them. So that's not going to be helpful. So what I need to do instead is have this, not here, take it out, and have this run function return more than a potential error. So I'll have it return, what shall I have it return? I shall have it return my driver DB. So it's a pointer to driver DB and an error. So now I got a few things to fix. Down here, I can't return nothing, return just the error. I have to return nil in the error because I couldn't create it. I'll just die at this point. And down here, I'll return my DB. So that will take care of the errors for the run function. But up here, I can't just have error equals run. Instead, I say DB and error equals run. And I'm not using DB right now, but if I get past this, then I want to defer db.sql.close. And now the database connection won't be closed until the main function itself stops running, which means the application is stopped. So that's very good. So I've actually got this database connection right now, but I'm not doing anything with it, and I need to do something with it. So what shall I do with it? Well, back down here in the run function, I need to ensure that my database connection is available, certainly to my handlers, possibly something else, but certainly to my handlers. So over in our handlers, what I'm going to do is change this repository and have it hold another repository. So what am I going to put in here? I'll call it DB because it's a database connection, and it's of type repository. Try that again. Repository database repo. And down here, I'll actually accept a second parameter, and it will not be a repository, but it will instead be a DB, which is a pointer to driver DB. And I'll have to pass that in the main function, but we'll do that in a minute. And now I will populate my DB repository, not with DB, because that's not a repository. That's a pointer to driver DB. Instead, I'll call that new Postgres repo function that I made in my dbrepo.go file. So I call dbrepo, new Postgres repo, and it requires our connection, which is DB, and it requires our app config. So I'll put that in there as well. Probably don't need app config there, but it's not going to hurt. It's not DB, it's db.sql. There. Now that matches the correct type. So what I've done here, when I call new repo, I'm going to pass it my app config, which is a pointer to config app config. I'm going to pass it my database connection pool, which is a pointer to driver DB, which holds my database connection pool. And then I populate this repository type up here with all the information I received as parameters and hand that back as a pointer to a repository. So I've created that. Now we need to go back to our main function, and you'll discover that we have an error. And the error is I need to pass that second parameter, which is db. And that should create our repository. So with that one change, think about what I've done here. I've now created this handler, this repo that I'm going to use in my handlers. We have our application config available to all of our handlers, and we can put whatever we want in there. And we've also passed it this DB, which is not a database connection pool tied to a specific database. Instead, it's a pointer to a driver. And that driver can, right now, only handle Postgres, but I can very easily, just by creating a new instance, a new function instead of new Postgres, I can create a new MySQL function. So I can have this repository for the handlers hold a repository that's of a type for Postgres or MySQL or Oracle or MongoDB or whatever I want. Now let's see how this is all going to work. You recall a little while ago, first of all, let's make sure this runs and run my application. Okay, it compiled. That's good. I'm going to put one more log in there just to say I actually connected to the database. So log.println connected to database. I'll run it again just to get some feedback. So I'll clear the screen and run it again. And everything passed. Good. All right. So now that I've done this, how can I use it? How can I put some methods or some functions available to this repository for the database that I've created and passed right here? How can I actually use some functions in there? Well, you may recall we have this interface that's of type database. It's a type database repo. That's an interface. I'm going to create another file inside of the DB repo folder, and I'm going to call it postgres.go. And here is where I will put any functions that I want to be available to that interface. So I'll create a function, I'll call it, and it has to have a receiver, and I'll call the receiver M for model, and it's of type Postgres DB repo, which links it to my Postgres repository, and I'll call it all users. And it's right now it's not going to take any parameters, and it's just going to return a bool. This is going to change. This is just to show you how it works, and I'll just have this return true. So I've defined this all users function that has a receiver of Postgres DB repo. So what I'm going to do is copy the function name and its return type, and I'll paste it right into my repository. Now that I've done that, now that this function is listed in the interface and the function exists with a receiver of Postgres DB repo, and the function exists exactly as it's defined in the interface, now I can go over to my handlers and I can choose any handler, say the home function, for example, and on that repository, I now have access to the DB, and I can call all users. And that is really, really cool and very useful, because all I have to do when I want to add new functionality to that DB member of the repository, I'll get rid of this because we're not going to use it here. All I have to do is define my function in here with this receiver and add it to the repository. And then I have access to all of my database functions, which we'll be writing in the coming lectures. I have access to all of them right in my handlers, just because I've created that repository that holds a database repository. All right, so in the next few lectures, we'll start thinking about what we need to be able to do in our database, and we'll write some functions, and then we'll update our handlers to use those functions. We're getting closer.